Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer, and welcome to my challenge. Welcome to my channel. It is a challenge to speak, apparently. So this week I'm going to be just talking about the books that I've been reading this week. How is this hard for me to say this? But the thing I will add is I'm about to be away for a few weeks, so my weekly reads videos will be replaced by something else for a little bit. And we'll pick back up again when I return, but no weekly reads for about 3 weeks or so, just because I'll be in Canada and I will probably not have any time to read. If not, if you know, even just making a video might be a bit time hard. It will be very time hard. I cannot do words. I need to go on holiday. This is not even a holiday. I'm going to stop talking. Here are the books I read this week. Now that I've got some of that garbling out of the way, the first book I read was In Ascension by Martin MacInnes. And I probably will eventually do a separate video on this just because I think it's a really interesting book and it has so many layers and it's so interesting. But essentially the core idea of it is that our sort of protagonist, Lee, is a young woman who has had a life of quite a lot of abuse and quite a lot of difficulty in many different ways, and sort of this really complicated relationship with her family as a result. And she gets more and more involved in various bits of research around trying to create this sort of algae style thing that will be able to support life in many ways. And so this sort of develops further and further where, you know, they recognize her skills. She's brought on board further and further into what's incredibly seems to be this incredibly challenging environment, and increasingly seems to be an environment that is full of secrets. You know, she increasingly starts to find that her life is dominated by this research. She eventually gets into a situation where it looks like, you know, there's going to be a real sort of distance between her and her family are going through some things, and particularly her mother's health. And so she starts to move into this world, meanwhile trying to deal with all of the trauma and difficulties of her life that have been surrounding it. And I just found this book so beautifully done in terms of, it could have been weighed down by the really sciencey bits, and I think it just about kept afloat and was just on the right side of things. And it could have been really sort of mired in a lot of the darkness around some of the trauma, but it doesn't really do that either. And so I think it manages to keep this real propulsion towards this story in a way that's so fascinating, and I think just so beautifully written. Like there's a real poetry to some of the lines of this. It's just gorgeously written. So I really loved this. I think it's a really stunning book, and I'm really intrigued by it now to see whether it also troubles a couple of prize lists this year. But it's not the only reason I read it, but I think it's a really interesting book. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, because I think it has a lot of sort of secrets to reveal. I think it sort of slowly blossoms and unfurls as it goes. Next up is a bit of a 2-for-1, A House for Alice by Diana Evans, and also Ordinary People, the book that precedes this, but which I don't have a physical copy of. Ordinary People, let's start with that, is a book that deals with, as the name suggests, sort of some fairly average people living their lives in South London. And the thing that I find really unnerving in some ways is it's very, very local to places I know, and will often reference exact roads or hills or whatever, and I know exactly what she's talking about, and it's really quite unnerving, because I'm used to, you know, people describing bits of London that I don't know, or like even bits of South London I don't know, but then to have somebody be like, so you go down this road and then round that corner is this, I'm like, I can fill in the rest for you. I know exactly where you are. I know exactly the hotel you're talking about. This is scary. But it follows the lives of these characters, and a big part of that is them having these sort of relationship breakups and the sort of difficulty around understanding a whole other human. You know, you're in a relationship with a human, another person, you know, how do you understand their full lives? You know, how after so many years do you still surprise each other? Do you still work things out? You know, the couple that's sort of having a breakup in the sort of heart of this book, a big part of that is they've had kids, and you know, the husband is not pulling his weight, and so there's this sort of real difficulty there, and just so many little bits like that. but it's sort of full of this sort of, it's a really interesting just story following these characters' lives. And one of the characters in that is Alice, who is a mother, and she appears in this book as well. And this book is sort of more around her as her family tries to understand how to best support her. She basically wants to move away. She is tired of London and wants to spend out her last days somewhere else. And this is all also happening as the Grenfell Tower disaster is happening in the UK. And so this, building that's been built poorly, that's been maintained poorly, and that has led to the deaths of many people and sort of displacement of many people, is sort of a thing going on in the background here of just sort of London and the UK suddenly seeming like a much more hostile and a much less safe place than it had done before. And so Alice starts to really ponder what she wants to do next. Meanwhile, her family are trying to work out their own things, but also work out how they best support their mother. And I think this book does some really interesting things in terms of how it describes those familial relationships, right? The fact that, like a brother and sister can have a huge argument about something relatively minor, but also something major will happen and they'll both be like, yeah, fine, cool, whatever. And it's just, so I think really well observed in many, many ways. Next up, we have Bournville by Jonathan Coe. And this is a book that deals a lot with particularly the politics of the last few years. And one big part of that is things around Brexit and sort of lots of those sorts of things. I mean, it deals a bit with COVID as well. It's sort of, fun thing to read as a Brit in 2023. But it's a book that kind of deals a lot with how sort of these have changed and grown over time. The way that nations see themselves, for example. So Brexit is contrasted with Germany, particularly, where Germany, we kind of go right back to World War II. We go to the aftermath of lots of Germans being seen as in a certain way. The World Cup, where the UK is sort of very proud of having beaten West Germany. And then we fast forward to things like, for example, Princess Diana's wedding. And so it's sort of almost like a little bit of a trip through British history, sort of modern British history, and particularly what that's done in terms of shaping how Britain sees itself. But then interestingly, from there, sort of pivots to kind of, okay, well, actually, for example, Germans were, even naturalized English citizens who had German family were seen as other and not quite right. And actually that is also sort of some of the seeds of then the way that some people talk about Brexit, as sort of Britain seeing itself as being alone from the rest of the continent and all of these other things. So it's a book that deals quite a lot with some of that in often quite funny ways. There's it's a little throwaway joke, but I did appreciate it, of somebody going to see Agatha Christie's Mousetrap, the play version, and somebody saying, "Oh, I thought it was awful. It's not going to be here for long." The joke being that it's been one of the longest running plays of all time. But I mean, it's not like a laugh out loud joke, but had to be there, I guess. But it's sort of a book that deals a lot with that, and so I found it interesting. I think at times a little bit like, okay, I can kind of see where things are going here, but I still think is an interesting thing about the state of Britain at the moment. It's got an interesting insight into all of that. And last but not least, a book I've just started, but it'll otherwise be 3 weeks until I talk about this book again. Paul Harding's This Other Eden, which I've just started. I'm about 60 or 70 pages in so far. But it's a book that I'm really intrigued by. It is a book that deals with a group of people who are on a small island, and it's an island that is incredibly diverse and multicultural, just partly because of where people have either been brought over through enslavement or through whatever else, but also just where people have kind of naturally ended up. And the bit that I've got to has just started dealing with the ways that the islanders might start to really think about race, particularly as there is a quote in there from Darwin talking about talking about race and essentially sort of eugenics. And this book sort of is about to start really grappling with that. So really intrigued to see where this goes. Yeah, and I'll touch base, get back, whatever. Whenever I'm back in the UK, I'll eventually talk about it again. But a really, really interesting book, nonetheless, so far from what I've read. And those have been the books that I've read, where are they, this week. And I'm really intrigued to hear a little bit more about what you've been reading. Like I mentioned, I'll be away for a few weeks, so no more weekly reads for a little bit, but I'll have some other videos that I've been scheduling that you will see at some point, hopefully. Take care, have a great time, and I'll see you on the other side, as they say. I don't know who they are. I'll see you then. I'll see you in a bit. But take care and speak to you soon. Bye-bye.